Hey guys, tonight we step down beneath the restless skin of old New York into damp brick cellars, candlelit vaults, and the kind of underground darkness where every sound feels slightly more important than it probably is. Above you, the year is 1835, and Manhattan is clattering, steaming, growing, and tripping over its own ambitions. Below you, in the imagination that gathers around half-lit history, there may be something else. Chambers of pressure, iron valves, strange pipes, and rumours of air-powered generators, hidden beneath a city that was already learning how to breathe smoke. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what-if imagination. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Historians debate records thin out, and old infrastructure often leaves just enough of a shadow to make your brain do that very human thing where it whispers, "Well now, hang on." And as always, you probably would not survive this very well. Mostly because 19th century basements smell like wet rope lamp grease and decisions made by men named Ebenezer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from, along with your local time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of Lower Manhattan in your mind, where the city is still compact enough to feel intimate, but already swollen with commerce, noise, and appetite. Most historians agree that New York in the 1830s is a place of fast expansion, uneven sanitation, crowded streets, and relentless building. Wharves jut into the harbour. Cartwheels grind over mud and stone. Horses produce with heroic regularity the kind of street contribution that no tourism board would ever turn into a postcard. The air carries salt from the river soot, from coal fires, and the sharp metallic scent of workshops, where somebody is always hammering, planing, hoisting, filing, or inventing something that may improve civilization or may simply explode near a cousin. What is broadly accepted is that this is a city obsessed with movement. Goods move from ship to street, from wagon to warehouse, from counting room to storefront. Labour moves before dawn and after dark. Water moves badly in some places and too freely in others. Information moves by voiced newspaper and hurried foot. New York is learning in its own loud and uncomfortable way that a modern city is less a collection of buildings than a giant system of circulation. And once you begin thinking of the city as a body, it becomes very tempting to imagine hidden organs inside it. One interpretation is that later stories about concealed air-powered machines may have grown from that exact urban reality. Basements were everywhere. Vaulted storage rooms sat beneath shops, taverns, hotels, and mercantile buildings. Cellars held coal casks, tools, ledgers, perishables, and the secrets of whatever respectable business preferred not to explain itself too clearly. If a person in 1835 heard hissing in a wall, felt a vibration in the floorboards, or noticed a row of iron pipes disappearing into darkness, he might assume something practical, or being human, he might assume something marvellous. It's possible that both instincts lived side by side. So you begin where the story feels most plausible, not with a giant hidden machine worthy of a fever dream, but with ordinary underground space. Beneath the shops of Pearl Street and the counting houses nearer the docks, brick-lined rooms stay cool and dim. Moisture beads on stone. The ceilings are low enough to encourage humility and possibly spinal regret. A lantern flame wavers when a draft slips through cracks around a shutter or a service hatch. Rats do their quiet little property inspections. Somewhere above, boots cross a floor, a barrel rolls, a clerk coughs, and a door slams hard enough to remind you that the world upstairs has no idea you are down here inventing mysteries. The evidence we do have points to a New York deeply dependent on hidden infrastructure, though not necessarily the sort that conspiracy-minded imaginations prefer. Cisterns, drains, privies, storage chambers, furnace rooms, and service corridors all existed in different forms across the growing city. That fact matters because hidden systems do not have to be fantastical to become the seed of legend. Sometimes the rumour starts because something real is already there, only poorly understood. A careful reading might suggest that when people later whispered about machines beneath the streets, they could have been blending memory, misunderstanding, and genuine fragments of technology. And this is where the year 1835 becomes especially interesting. America is in the thick of early industrial change. Steam power is increasingly important. Workshops are becoming more mechanized. Cities are experimenting, improvising, and adopting new tools with uneven speed. Most historians agree that if you want the dominant energy story of the age, you look first to steam muscle, water power, and gaslight, not to some polished secret network humming invisibly under Manhattan like a Victorian science fiction novel. That's the solid ground. But if we treat the more mysterious claims as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question shifts. What if the rumors were not describing a full underground empire of hidden generators but isolated experiments, unusual installations or mechanical systems that felt uncanny to the people who encountered them? Historians still argue whether later urban myths preserve garbled memories of real early technologies or simply reflect the human need to add drama to old brickwork. That debate matters because cities are excellent machines for producing ghost stories without ghosts. Every pipe sounds intentional when you cannot see where it leads. Every thump becomes suspicious when it happens below your feet. Every sealed door looks important, especially if it is locked by someone with impressive sideburns. And the 19th century, bless it, is full of sideburns, so committed they deserve their own property tax category. Picture yourself walking at dusk along a narrow commercial block. The last orange light is slipping off upper windows. A porter shoulders a sack into a cellar entrance. The hatch stays open for a moment too long, and from below rises a cool breath of mineral air tinged with oil and iron. You hear a pulsing exhale, subtle but rhythmic. Not steam exactly, not a bellows exactly, just a breath as if the basement itself were working. A more cautious explanation could be simple equipment ventilation or the ordinary noises of urban labor. That may well be all it is. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is the most likely explanation. But what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden truth with trumpets and dramatic music, but a puzzle made of practical fragments. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight, the evidence is thin in exactly the way that keeps a story alive. New York in 1835 is real enough to touch muddy, ambitious, overbuilt, underdrained, and already layering one future on top of another. Under that city are the spaces that make the legend possible. Not because they prove anything, but because they create the right stage set for mystery. Damp vaults, iron fittings, low arches, a hiss in the wall, a labourer emerging into the alley with soot on his cuffs and no reason to explain what he has seen downstairs. And so you keep descending one careful step at a time into the oldest version of the question. Before the theories grow grand, before the rumours sharpen into claims, before anybody declares that some forbidden technology was never meant to be seen, there is simply a city above a cellar below, and the faint suggestion of pressure moving through darkness like a held breath. You follow that held breath deeper into the working underbelly of the city, where markets above depend on the cool patience of cellars below. What's broadly accepted is that 1830s Manhattan runs on storage as much as on spectacle. Before refrigeration, before clean modern delivery systems, before anyone can casually complain online about delayed groceries, cities rely on darkness, shade, dampness, and brick. Merchants need places where flour can stay dry, where barrels can sit in stable temperatures, where tools and goods can wait, without immediately surrendering to heat rot or theft. That means basements are not an oddity in this period. They are essential. You do not build a commercial city and forget the spaces underneath it. You simply try not to think too much about what is growing in the corners. So you enter one of those lower rooms in your mind. The floor is compacted earth in one place, worn plank in another. The walls sweat slightly in summer. A line of casks rests against brickwork blackened by years of lamp smoke. Iron hoops catch the light. Somewhere near the ceiling, a vent or narrow grating lets in a thread of street sound muffled until wagon wheels become a distant rumble, almost like weather. The room feels stable, serviceable, and faintly secretive, which is often all a rumour needs to put on a top hat and start introducing itself as mystery. Most historians agree that these underground spaces serve practical needs first: food storage, coal storage, workshop, overflow utility access, and commercial security all belong to the ordinary life of an expanding port city. New York's growth makes hidden service space more valuable, not less. Above ground square footage earns money. Below ground square footage protects the machinery of earning it. A more cautious explanation for any strange understreet stories is simply that people encountered the hidden physical systems of commerce without always understanding what each piece did. Pipes, ducts, vents, drains, pumps, shutters, flues, furnace passages and storage vaults could look impressive even when they were performing glorified housekeeping. Still, one interpretation is that certain sealed or unusually equipped basement rooms may have inspired later speculation for a reason. If you imagine a cellar fitted not only with shelving and barrels but with thicker iron piping pressure valves, unusual tanks or hand-operated pumping gear, you can see how memory would begin to distort around it. A machine does not have to be revolutionary to feel uncanny in the half-light. It only has to be unfamiliar loud in the wrong way and owned by someone who answers questions with the energy of a man hiding either an invention or an accounting problem. The evidence we do have points to a city increasingly comfortable with mechanisms tucked out of sight. Pumping water, moving waste, managing air in enclosed spaces, and servicing workshops all required systems people rarely celebrated in public, though they benefited from them constantly. Urban modernity, even in its rough early form, is full of things people depend on without wanting to look at. That pattern matters because the hidden generator story lives in exactly that emotional gap. You benefit from the unseen. You do not understand the unseen. Therefore, naturally, the unseen becomes suspicious. Humanity has always been talented at that. We see one pipe and immediately imagine a subterranean empire run by a very stern committee. Picture the district around the markets and docks where goods arrive in quantity and vanish in portions. Flour, salt, pork, lamp oil, imported cloth, hardware crates of fruit in season dry goods, rope, tobacco, and the countless necessary items of a city trying to look richer each year than it did the year before. The commerce above requires organization below. Workers move up and down narrow staircases carrying ledgers, lanterns, and loads on bent shoulders. A hatch opens, cold damp air rises, a lamp descends. The smell changes from horse smoke and seaweed to mildew, old wood and iron. If a person working down there hears a rhythmic force moving through pipes, he may call it ventilation or pumping, or simply machinery. If another person hears the same sound from the alley and never sees the apparatus, the imagination has more freedom. A careful reading might suggest that stories of hidden pressure rooms grew from this ordinary mismatch between user knowledge and observer ignorance. The man operating the system knows it as a tool. The man passing overhead knows it as a rumor. By the time the third man retells it in a tavern, it has become a machine beneath the city, powerful enough to make the candles tremble and the walls breathe. Taverns, as a rule, have never been famous for making things smaller. Historians still argue whether later descriptions of mysterious understreet power were shaped by actual early experiments, by misunderstood service systems, or by the simple tendency of city law to inflate every locked door into destiny. That is the point where you keep your balance and avoid dramatic certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. What's widely accepted is that New York's commercial cellars were numerous, useful, and often poorly documented in ways that leave room for confusion. That is solid ground. Beyond that, the mist begins. It's possible that some merchants or mechanics adapted compressed air principles for limited tasks, perhaps to assist pumping, powering small devices, or controlling movement, in ways later witnesses failed to describe clearly. It's also possible that no such remarkable devices existed in 1835 on any meaningful scale, and that later generations simply projected more advanced ideas backward into an earlier age because old brick vaults make people feel poetic and mildly suspicious. And yet the physical setting keeps tempting you. Think of a long barrel-vaulted room under a street near the waterfront. At one end stands a compact arrangement of metalwork, a tank, a flywheel, a set of joints, maybe a regulator arm. Nearby, a labourer wipes condensation from a coupling and listens for leaks with the seriousness of a man who knows one loose fitting could ruin his evening. There is no orchestra here, no sparkling science fiction glow, only oil breath and pressure. A popular rumour claims that beneath early New York there existed generators far ahead of their time, hidden deliberately from public view. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because the architecture of the old city makes concealment feel believable. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you do not need a vast secret network to sustain the legend. You need only a handful of strange rooms, a few unusual noises, and enough missing paperwork to let the imagination finish the blueprints. Most historians agree that when cities grow quickly, documentation becomes uneven. Buildings change owners, tenants come and go, uses shift. One decade's storage room becomes another decade's furnace chamber workshop annex or sealed crawl space. That churn creates blind spots, and blind spots are where urban folklore sets up housekeeping, usually rent-free. So you keep moving among the cellars, those practical lungs of the city, where cool air settles around barrels and brick, where labour disappears below the floorboards and returns carrying the city's appetite on its back. Whether these rooms held only the usual instruments of commerce, or occasionally something more experimental, remains an open question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and in the soft hiss that seems just for a moment a little too deliberate to be ordinary. That soft hiss lingers in your ears as you leave the merchant cellars and drift toward the people most likely to feed a legend without meaning to inventors, mechanics, tinkerers, and ambitious men with stained cuffs who believe the future is just one improved valve away. Most historians agree that the 1830s are crowded with experiment. This is an age in love with devices. Steam power is spreading, machine shops are multiplying, patents, prototypes, and practical hacks appear in workshops large and small. Some inventions change everything. Others disappear after 3 weeks and a loud smell. The point is not that every inventor is a genius. The point is that invention itself has become a habit. So if you want to understand how a story about hidden air-powered generators beneath New York could take root, you do not begin with a secret society or a forbidden map. You begin with a city full of mechanically curious people trying to solve ordinary problems in new ways. How do you move force from one room to another? How do you reduce smoke? How do you control pressure, save fuel, or make an engine safer indoors? These are not outrageous questions in 1835. They are the sort of questions practical minds ask when the age around them keeps groaning, sparking, leaking, and setting its eyebrows on fire. What's broadly accepted is that steam dominates the imagination of the era. If power has a public face in this period, it is steam. Steam is noisy, visible, theatrical, and a little terrifying, which in many centuries is basically how technology gets respect. Boilers, furnaces, pistons, and engines carry the glamour of modern effort. You can point to fire, you can hear steam, you can admire the hiss and clank and say, yes, civilization is clearly happening. Compressed air, by contrast, is subtler. It does not announce itself with the same visual drama. It works through restraint, containment, release. It is the sort of force that can be impressive without being charismatic like a very competent clerk. And yet one interpretation is that precisely because compressed air lacks spectacle, it may have been attractive for certain limited experiments in enclosed urban settings. A careful reading might suggest that mechanics interested in pumping ventilation, transmission of force, or cleaner indoor operation could have toyed with air pressure in small ways long before large-scale pneumatic systems became famous later in the 19th century. That possibility is not the same as evidence for some vast hidden network in 1835. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream historical ground does not support a fully documented subterranean system of advanced air-powered generators beneath New York at that date, but it does leave open the more modest idea that scattered mechanical experiments may have occurred and later attracted inflated retellings. Picture a workshop near the lower wards. The room is narrow, lit by windows, grimed over with city soot. Iron parts rest on benches. Belts, hand tools, fittings, and sketches crowd the space with the serene confidence of controlled chaos. A mechanic in shirt sleeves tests a valve assembly beside a small tank. He is not trying to change the world before lunch. He is trying to make force behave. In a back room, perhaps below street level, he arranges piping along a wall and watches a gauge or a weighted regulator respond. The sound is not the dramatic cough of steam, but a contained exhale. A pressure system may have seemed useful in cases where fire risk, smoke noise, or space created problems. It's possible that even temporary installations, if seen out of context, could later sound wildly advanced in retelling. The evidence we do have points to an inventive culture willing to try odd things, even if most odd things left faint traces. That matters more than people sometimes realize. History is not made only by the machines that triumph. It is also shaped by prototypes, dead ends, partial successes, and local contraptions that never become standard. Most historians agree that countless experiments from the industrial age vanished from everyday memory, precisely because they failed, remained small-scale, or were absorbed into later technologies. A fringe idea proposes that hidden air power systems in New York were suppressed because they threatened other energy interests. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because lost inventions make irresistible folklore. They flatter us. They suggest that brilliance was hidden just out of view, like treasure buried beneath a bookkeeping office. Historians still argue whether stories of forgotten technologies usually begin with real but limited experiments or with later generations reading mystery into ordinary machinery. That debate is especially useful here because it helps you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On the solid ground, 1830s inventors absolutely exist, and many are trying to improve mechanical efficiency in a rapidly changing society. Workshops, foundries, and machine culture are real. On the mistier ground, you have the question of whether one or two individuals in New York might have pursued compressed air systems more creatively than surviving records make obvious. That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. But thin evidence does not mean empty imagination. It means you move carefully. And careful movement reveals something interesting. The very logic of compressed air fits the urban underground more neatly than steam does in certain respects. Steam requires heat fuel combustion, exhaust, and visible management. Compressed air, once generated, can be transmitted and released elsewhere with less immediate drama at the point of use. That does not make it magical. It just makes it adaptable in theory. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not giant power plants buried under Manhattan, but hidden mechanical rooms where force was stored and redirected in ways later witnesses found hard to describe. Not forbidden super technology, but practical ingenuity wrapped in darkness and misunderstanding. You can imagine, for instance, a merchant landlord or engineer willing to fund a trial setup beneath a property where noise and smoke were undesirable. The machine sits in a lower chamber behind a locked iron gate because expensive apparatus tends to attract both curiosity and theft, which are often siblings. A labourer pumps or tends the system. A line carries pressure to another room. Maybe it powers a specialised tool. Maybe it assists with pumping water or moving goods. Maybe it simply fails leaks and gets dismantled after disappointing everyone involved. But for the 2 months it operates, neighbours hear regular breaths below the floor and develop opinions. A popular rumour claims that early New York hid technology the public was not meant to see. A more cautious explanation could be that city people simply saw fragments of workshop culture without context and built grand theories from scraps. The human brain adores scraps. Give it one iron pipe entering a wall and it will write a 10-part mystery by candlelight. So you remain with the inventors a little longer because they are the missing bridge between ordinary basement utility and extraordinary later rumour. In their cramped rooms among grease filings, diagrams and half-successful ideas, the legend becomes less absurd and more human. You do not need a master conspiracy to explain it. You need restless curiosity, partial records, improvised machinery, and a city ready to misunderstand what it cannot easily see. Under those conditions, even a modest experiment can begin to sound in memory like the future breathing underground. By now, the idea of the city has changed in your mind. It is no longer just streets, storefronts and wharves. It is rhythm, it is repetition. It is the constant overlap of footsteps, wheel rims, shouted prices, door bolts, hoisted crates, coughs, bells, and somewhere beneath it all, perhaps another layer of sound that does not quite belong to the surface. Most historians agree that 1830s New York is loud in the ordinary way of a fast-growing port city. Horses strike stone, wagons rattle, dock labourers grunt at impossible loads, shopkeepers call into the street. Construction happens everywhere because in a city like this, if something is not being repaired, expanded, unloaded or argued over, everyone assumes civilization has briefly collapsed. That accepted noise matters because it gives cover to every smaller sound underneath it. One interpretation is that unusual underground machinery, if it existed in limited places, might easily have gone unnoticed in broad daylight, while becoming more noticeable at night, or in moments when traffic briefly thinned and the city's background roar loosened its grip. A careful reading might suggest that many old urban mysteries begin not with what people saw, but with what they heard and could not place. Sight gives confidence. Sound gives imagination far too much room to decorate. So listen carefully, not with modern ears expecting engines and electrical hum, but with the ear of someone in 1835. Someone trained by daily life to distinguish hooves from handcarts, rain on shutters from ash on rooftops, a steam vent from a smithy, bellows a cellar hatch dropping from a barrel rolling below. Under that sensory education, a strange underground pulse might stand out precisely because it feels almost familiar, but not fully recognizable. A sustained exhale, a rhythmic knocking softened by brick, a hollow thump followed by silence, then another, as if pressure were being built, held and released in some regular cycle. The evidence we do have points to a city full of subterranean and semi-subterranean sounds with entirely practical causes. Pumps, drains, furnace rooms, storage activity, underground water movement and construction all created noises that travelled unpredictably through dense urban fabric. Sound in old cities is a trickster. It bends around walls, climbs through grates, vanishes in open air, and reappears 2 doors down, as if it has changed its mind halfway through the journey. A more cautious explanation could be that later accounts of mysterious underground machinery were little more than the ordinary acoustics of a heavily built environment. That may be true in many cases. To be clear, this is debated. But when you imagine the city at dusk, the mystery becomes easier to feel. You are standing near a cobbled lane after sundown. The day's commerce has thinned. Windows glow amber. A watchman turns his collar against the damp. A cart passes, then another, then the street goes briefly quiet except for the harbour wind and the little wet noises of the city settling into evening. Then it comes. A low breath under the pavement, followed by a faint metallic tremor. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong enough to make you pause. The stones underfoot seem to answer with a tiny vibration. You look around. No obvious source, no open hatch, no team of labourers, just brick facades, shuttered doors, and the odd feeling that the street itself is working late. A popular rumour claims that people in old New York sometimes heard mechanical breathing beneath the ground as though hidden generators pulsed under selected blocks. This theory is not widely accepted, and if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, there are many less exotic explanations available. Basement pumps, workshop apparatus, stored pressure released through valves, or even the strange behaviour of water and air in enclosed urban spaces could produce effects later remembered with more mystery than accuracy. Still, rumour clings hardest when it wraps around sensation. A story you hear is one thing, a vibration in your souls is another. Historians still argue whether the most persistent urban legends begin with a real sensory experience that later gets exaggerated, or with a story so often repeated that people begin to believe they experienced it themselves. That uncertainty feels especially appropriate in a city always rebuilding over itself. New York is already a place where one structure backs onto another, where basements extend oddly, where property lines wiggle like apologetic snakes, and where no sane person could look at every hidden wall and say with complete confidence what lies beyond it. Sound thrives in such confusion. A workshop in one building may seem to rumble under the next. A pressure release in a cellar may hiss through a seam in the paving half a block away. A hand pump operating in a basement room can become for the listener across the street a machine of doubtful and therefore irresistible significance. Most historians agree that the human habit of misplacing sound is ancient and undefeated. You hear the kettle whistle in one room and search the wrong corner. You hear your phone buzz and discover you are holding it. You hear a noise in the walls at night and immediately promote one mouse into a supernatural committee. In 19th century Manhattan, where sound bounced through brick vaults, culverts, iron fittings, and narrow alleys, those misunderstandings could grow into local folklore remarkably fast. But folklore rarely grows from pure nonsense. It usually needs a seed. One interpretation is that the seed here may have been the occasional presence of genuinely unusual mechanical setups in basements or service rooms, an inventor's trial apparatus, a merchant's pumping system, a specialized ventilating arrangement, a pressure tank used for a limited task, not a city-wide hidden grid perhaps, but a handful of machines rare enough to sound uncanny. If a bystander heard one of them repeatedly without ever seeing it, memory could do the rest. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not evidence of forbidden technology, but evidence of how partial encounters with innovation can feel almost supernatural when filtered through darkness and time. Picture a child lying awake above a street-level shop, hearing through the floorboards a distant measured breathing from below. Picture a night porter pausing with his lantern at a corner where the stones seem to murmur after midnight. Picture a warehouse clerk laughing it off in public, then taking the long way home because the sound under Nassau Street was frankly a bit much. None of that proves anything. This is suggestive, not conclusive, yet it helps explain why hidden machine stories survive even when paperwork fails them. Documents can vanish. Sensory stories travel orally. They cling to blocks, businesses, and family memories. They become part of the city's unofficial anatomy. And so you keep listening. Above you, New York continues its ordinary racket full of trade and soot and ambition. Below you, whether through pumps, pressure, ducts, drains, or something slightly more inventive, the unseen city answers in brief breaths and muted knocks. The mystery is not that every sound has a secret meaning. The mystery is that a few of them may once have belonged to mechanisms just unusual enough to vanish into rumour the moment the rooms that housed them were sealed, sold, or rebuilt over. The pavement cools, the lantern light thins, and somewhere in the dark below the city seems to exhale again. That exhale fades, and in its place comes paper, or rather the lack of paper. Old cities are built from brick, timber, iron, and labour, but they are also built from records, ledgers, permits, deeds, surveys, insurance descriptions, engineering notes and letters written by people who assumed someone later would care. Most historians agree that when records survive, they can make the past look impressively orderly. The trouble is that cities rarely preserve themselves as neatly as historians would like. Buildings burn, offices move, basements flood, clerks retire, boxes go unlabeled. One generation's vital technical memorandum becomes the next generation's excellent surface for a coffee cup or a leaking candle stub. History, sadly, is often only one distracted bookkeeper away from becoming folklore. What's broadly accepted is that New York lost enormous amounts of documentary detail over time, not only through catastrophe, but through ordinary neglect and continual redevelopment. In the 19th century, paper accumulates quickly and protection for it is uneven. Municipal systems are improving, but they are not omniscient. Private business records remain private until they disappear. Plans for small installations, temporary alterations, rented basements, experimental apparatus, or short-lived commercial ventures may never enter a formal archive at all. That matters because once a story depends on missing plans, the imagination arrives wearing its coat and asking where it may sit. One interpretation is that the legend of hidden air-powered generators survives partly because the kind of evidence people want would be exactly the kind most likely to vanish. If a merchant funded a small mechanical experiment in a cellar, the paperwork might have lived in private correspondence, a property ledger, an invoice from a machinist, or a folded sketch tucked inside a drawer, later emptied without ceremony. A careful reading might suggest that the absence of documents does not prove the machines existed, but it does explain why proving or disproving them becomes so frustrating. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is that fires changed everything. Most historians agree that 19th century cities were vulnerable to devastating urban fires, and New York had more than enough timber, crowded structures, stored fuel and human carelessness to keep that risk uncomfortably alive. Even when a fire did not swallow an entire district, smoke, water salvage and hurried rebuilding could scatter records beyond recovery. Add demolition, resale, expansion, and the simple habit of treating yesterday's technical details as tomorrow's rubbish, and whole layers of the city's story begin to blur. A popular rumor claims that certain plans were deliberately removed because they hinted at technology too unusual, too useful, or too disruptive to publicize. This theory is not widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be far less dramatic. Most missing records vanish because bureaucracy is mortal, storage is imperfect, and people in every century believe someone else will preserve the important things. Still, secrecy feels more satisfying than clerical sloppiness, which is unfair to clerks but very generous to conspiracy theories. No one has ever leaned in dramatically and whispered they hid the truth in an unlabeled municipal box under some mildew, and yet that is often how truth actually disappears. Historians still argue whether archival silence should make us more skeptical of grand claims or more open to the possibility that small local experiments left too faint a trail to survive. That argument is worth lingering on because it helps you avoid the two laziest conclusions. The first is that no surviving blueprint means nothing unusual ever existed. The second is that missing paperwork itself counts as evidence of suppression. Neither is safe ground. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, New York's records are incomplete. Private documentation is often lost and redevelopment destroys context. On the mistier ground, a few odd notations, unexplained basement alterations, strange references to pressure ventilation, mechanical fitting, or improvements could invite larger interpretations than they strictly deserve. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Imagine an old property file moving through time. In 1836, it contains a rough floor sketch, a receipt for ironwork, a note about reinforcing a lower chamber, and a terse line mentioning equipment removed after a tenant dispute. In 1852, half the file is missing. In 1871, the building has been altered. By 1890, the cellar has been partitioned. By 1910, the lot is under new management, and someone describes the basement only as serviceable storage, with unusual wall penetrations no longer in use. The modern researcher arrives and finds fragments that refuse to line up neatly. Not enough to claim a hidden generator. Not enough to dismiss curiosity either. Just enough to produce that irresistible sentence, something was happening here, but the paperwork has become annoyingly poetic. The evidence we do have points to another problem as well. Technical language changes. An apparatus described in one decade may sound stranger in another because familiar terms fell out of use or shifted meaning. A blower, a forcing device, a pressure arrangement, a receiver, a regulator, or a mechanical improvement might refer to something ordinary, experimental, or maddeningly vague depending on context. One interpretation is that later readers, already enchanted by pneumatic systems from a later era, may have looked back at ambiguous descriptions and imagined more sophistication than the original setup actually possessed. That possibility should make you cautious but not asleep at the wheel. Ambiguity can distort upward or downward. Sometimes we exaggerate old technology, sometimes we underestimate it because the wording sounds too humble. A fringe idea proposes that certain underground mechanical systems in early New York were part of a broader, intentionally obscured infrastructure. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the strongest version of that claim still struggles with evidence. There is no full consensus, and the direct documentation needed for such a sweeping case remains thin, but a smaller and more human version of the mystery still breathes. What if a few basement innovations existed, served local purposes, then disappeared into the city's churn so completely that all we have left are odd records, unusual spaces, and rumours that sound slightly more confident than they should? Most historians agree that cities do not erase the past cleanly. They smear it. They leave hints in brick scars, blocked arches, unexplained pipe entries and files that stop talking just when the interesting part should begin. That is why the hidden generator story persists. Not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because the absences feel shaped around something. Perhaps around something ordinary, perhaps around something inventive, perhaps around nothing more than the accumulated drama of old basements and missing plans. But when you are standing in the archive of the imagination, listening to folders rustle like dry leaves, even a blank space can seem to hum. That hum in the blank spaces draws you toward the people who spend their lives arguing with them. Not the rumour mongers in taverns now, but the historians, archivists, preservationists, engineers, urban archaeologists and enthusiastic amateurs who look at an old city and see not one past but several stacked and arguing quietly with each other. Most historians agree that later 19th century pneumatic systems are far better documented than anything anyone can confidently place beneath New York in 1835. That matters. It means the famous examples come later when records improve, patents multiply, newspapers grow more detailed, and urban infrastructure becomes easier to trace. If you want certainty, that later period gives you more to hold. But certainty is not tonight's mood. Tonight's mood is narrower, dimmer, and more stubborn. One interpretation is that the better documented later systems may have encouraged people to look backward and notice earlier clues they once ignored. A careful reading might suggest that once the public became familiar with the idea of transmitting force messages or materials through hidden systems, older memories began to rearrange themselves around that knowledge. The city had already contained basements, pipes, chambers, and experiments. Later technology gave those older fragments a fresh costume. That is one possibility. Another is that later scholars, engineers, and local historians have been too quick to dismiss early oddities because they do not fit clean narratives of technological progress. Most historians agree that history loves a tidy sequence: first this, then that, then the more advanced version. Real life is ruder. Real life produces detours, prototypes, side paths, and awkward half-successes that show up early, disappear, and then reappear decades later in cleaner form. Historians still argue whether forgotten technologies tend to vanish because they failed technically, because they lacked financial backing, or because they were simply too local and inelegant to leave a proper legacy. That question hangs over every old mechanical mystery. If an experiment with compressed air happened in a Manhattan cellar in 1835, what would it need in order to survive into accepted history? It would need records, witnesses, replication, usefulness, and probably a sponsor, with the patience to explain it to people not currently covered in flour or horse mud. Without those things, the idea might remain local. One workshop knows, one merchant complains about costs, one labourer tends the apparatus. One neighbour hears strange breathing below the stones and tells his wife. Then the tenant changes, the machinery is removed, and the event drops through the mesh of history like a coin through rotten floorboards. The evidence we do have points to an important tension in how experts approach stories like this. A more cautious explanation could be that skepticism is healthy because cities generate false mysteries by the dozen. Locked basements, missing records, odd acoustics, later projection, and popular appetite for hidden truths can turn absolutely ordinary infrastructure into a legend wearing a velvet cape. That happens all the time. At the same time, too much skepticism can flatten the past into a bureaucratic checklist, as if no one in 1835 ever improvised anything surprising unless the paperwork was stamped twice and stored correctly. Human beings are more inventive than their filing systems, often much more inventive. So you picture a discussion in a reading room, though, perhaps with less shouting than on the internet, which is always a blessing. One historian notes that large-scale compressed air infrastructure in 1835 Manhattan lacks strong documentation and should not be overstated. Solid point. Another observes that small-scale mechanical experiments could easily fall below the documentary horizon. Also, a solid point. An engineer adds that certain kinds of pressure systems are not implausible in principle, especially for local tasks. A preservationist mentions peculiar basement modifications in a few old structures whose original use remains uncertain. A rumour enthusiast in the back tries very hard to look scholarly while clearly yearning to say, exactly. Therefore the city was powered by invisible genius tubes. Everyone pretends not to notice. A popular rumour claims that a handful of researchers have quietly found signs of underground pressure rooms that do not match standard descriptions of storage or heating. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it occupies a tempting middle ground. It does not require a citywide conspiracy. It requires only enough anomalies to keep doubt alive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting question becomes not whether secret generators definitely existed, but why the same small pattern keeps resurfacing old basement spaces, unusual mechanical traces, weak documentation, and persistent local memory. Most historians agree that urban history is full of these recurring patterns. A wall seems thicker than expected. A sealed chamber appears on a later survey, but not an earlier one. Pipe routes do not align with obvious utilities. Mechanical fittings survive without the machine they once served. None of that proves anything dramatic. This raises the possibility that some spaces supported specialized equipment whose purpose has since become obscure. That is suggestive, not conclusive, yet suggestive details are often all an honest mystery has. One interpretation is that the real dispute here is not about machines at all, but about standards of proof. Scholars continue to debate how much weight to give material oddities when written evidence is scarce. Should a blocked arch, an unusual pressure fitting, or a reinforced lower room count as a clue to forgotten experimentation? Or are such features too common in old commercial architecture to support anything beyond curiosity? Historians still argue whether ambiguity should be treated as a warning sign or an invitation. And the answer, maddeningly, is often both. That is why the story remains strangely durable. It is not strong enough to become consensus. It is not weak enough to vanish. It lives in that narrow band where possibility keeps irritating certainty. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the city did not hide a revolutionary power system, but it did host a few early, clever, compressed air experiments that later generations embroidered into something grander that would explain the smell of truth around the rumour without requiring you to believe every dramatic whisper attached to it? We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part gives you a city of intense experimentation and messy records. The interpretation gives you scattered anomalies and plausible small-scale ingenuity. The imagination supplies the sound of a chamber below the street quietly taking breath, while the city above goes on buying oysters, tallying shipments, and stepping over mud. Somewhere between those layers, the debate keeps working like an old valve that has not quite seized. Not loud enough to settle the matter, just loud enough to remind you the question is still alive. That old valve keeps clicking in the background as the city changes shape above it. Streets straighten, buildings rise, shorelines shift, and blocks that once looked firmly planted begin on closer inspection to seem like temporary arrangements laid over older decisions. Most historians agree that New York repeatedly rebuilt, regraded, extended, and buried parts of itself. This is one of the most important facts in the whole story. The city you imagine in 1835 is already layered, but the city that follows becomes even more so, covering earlier foundations with new foundations filling low ground, redirecting service routes and swallowing yesterday's practical spaces beneath tomorrow's improvements. Urban progress, as always, has the tender grace of someone shoving furniture into a closet 5 minutes before guests arrive. What's broadly accepted is that Manhattan's physical fabric never stood still for long. Waterfronts shifted through landfill. Buildings were altered or replaced. Cellars became sub-cellars in effect when street grades changed or adjacent lots were built higher. Utility lines came later and threaded themselves through whatever older spaces they could avoid, exploit, or simply ignore. Archaeology suggests that cities like New York do not erase the past. They compress it. They fold old rooms into new systems and leave hidden voids where a later generation no longer remembers why a wall bulges, why a chamber was sealed, or why iron fittings protrude from brick that no longer seems to belong to anything. One interpretation is that this repeated layering may have hidden the sort of evidence that would once have made the generator story easier to judge. If a lower mechanical room existed in 1835, it would not need to survive cleanly into the present to leave a trace. It might be cut through by later masonry isolated behind infill or reduced to fragments that no longer announce their original purpose. A careful reading might suggest that the more the city modernized, the more likely early oddities were to become physically inaccessible and intellectually detached from their first context. The machine disappears, the chamber remains. Then the chamber is altered, and only one stubborn pipe entry or oddly reinforced wall survives teasing everyone equally. So you picture Manhattan as a stack rather than a map. At the top, traffic lights, impatient shoes, and delivery vans with no patience for romance. Below that, utility lines, foundation walls, forgotten crawl spaces, moisture rubble, patched brick, stale pockets of air. Below that, in older layers, traces of earlier property lines, discarded wells, blocked passages, storage vaults, and the remains of rooms once busy with labour, now reduced to silence. It is in that stacked city that the hidden generator story feels most at home. Not because buried things are always remarkable, but because burial itself protects confusion. And confusion in urban history ages beautifully. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth. Every generation misreads the hidden landscape inherited from the previous one. A later contractor finds a sealed chamber and calls it obsolete storage. An amateur researcher notices unusual pipe scars and imagines advanced machinery. A preservation survey notes mechanical alteration unknown and moves on to more immediate concerns like whether the ceiling intends to stay attached. Each interpretation is shaped by the knowledge of its own time. A more cautious explanation could be that many supposed clues to hidden pressure systems are merely the leftovers of ordinary service functions rendered strange by later ignorance. That is absolutely possible. Yet it is also possible that a few of those leftovers belong to systems once more specialized than anyone now can easily reconstruct. Historians still argue whether the burial of urban infrastructure makes fringe theories stronger by removing evidence or weaker by making every anomaly impossible to interpret with confidence. That question becomes almost physical when you imagine excavation. A work crew breaks through a later floor and finds an older brick vault below partially filled. In one wall sits a line of corroded iron collars. Another wall carries an arch that clearly once opened somewhere and now opens nowhere. On the floor lie fragments of bolts, a metal plate, perhaps a mount or bracket whose function is unclear. The immediate explanation may be perfectly ordinary. Storage, drainage, heating, ventilation, a workshop annex. Yet the arrangement resists easy labelling. The room seems built for more than passive storage, but less obvious than a furnace chamber. It has the posture of a machine room after the machine has gone. A fringe idea proposes that parts of lower Manhattan still conceal sealed service spaces linked to early pressure technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the city's constant rebuilding does give it a strangely durable shelter. You do not need direct continuity to sustain the mystery. You only need enough architectural leftovers to keep the question alive. A blocked passage here, a reinforced footing there, a cellar plan that no longer matches the building above it, a notation from a later renovation complaining about unusual lower obstructions with all the emotional warmth of a contractor discovering history precisely where he wanted a straight wall. Most historians agree that once cities bury their own utility, past interpretation becomes slippery. The original users are gone. The terminology fades. The apparatus is removed for scrap safety or salvage. And salvage, let us be fair, is the eternal enemy of future romance. Nothing kills a splendid mystery quite like someone in 1848 deciding that old iron might fetch a decent price. Still, you can feel how the legend gains strength from layering. A sound heard in 1835 becomes a story in 1860. A sealed room found in 1895 becomes evidence in 1920. A broken fitting photographed in 1970 becomes a forum argument in the modern age. Each generation inherits fragments and adds tone. One interpretation is that the generator story survives not because it was ever fully true in the dramatic way rumours prefer, but because the city itself keeps manufacturing partial clues. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if repeated rebuilding did not hide a single magnificent secret, but several smaller acts of ingenuity now detached from names, purposes, and neat explanation? We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground gives you a city that constantly buried its own earlier structures. The mist gives you the possibility that buried mechanical spaces once served unusual local functions, perhaps including pressure-related experiments or systems. Somewhere between those layers is the real emotional engine of the tale. You are standing above a city that has swallowed versions of itself again and again, and every time it did, some little room of practical labour may have slipped out of the official story and into the long afterlife of rumour. The pavement feels fixed. The past underneath it is anything but. By now you can feel what the story really is. Not a clean revelation. Not a hidden truth waiting politely in a folder. Not a grand machine humming intact beneath the modern city waiting for you to kick the right brick and discover history had been cheating. Most historians agree that the safest conclusion is also the least flashy one. 1835 New York was a real city of basements, workshops, storage vaults, improvised mechanical culture, incomplete records, and constant rebuilding. That alone is enough to produce strange traces. What's broadly accepted is that later pneumatic systems are much easier to document, while earlier clues remain frustratingly local, scattered, and hard to interpret. That is the solid ground, and it is solid enough to stand on. But one interpretation is that the solid ground itself may be the reason the mystery refuses to die. When you combine hidden service spaces, inventive mechanics, odd acoustics, missing plans, and buried layers of urban change, you get a setting where unusual local experiments are at least plausible, even if the boldest versions of the story outrun the evidence. A more cautious explanation could be that the legend of air-powered generators beneath New York is a collage made from real infrastructure, partial memory, and later imagination. That possibility may actually be more interesting than the dramatic claim. It turns the tale from a conspiracy into a city-sized misunderstanding, which is somehow both humbler and more human. The evidence we do have points to a puzzle rather than a conclusion. Some basement spaces may once have housed mechanical systems that felt unfamiliar to later observers. Some sounds under the street may have belonged to pumps, pressure devices, or workshop machinery that never earned formal attention. Some odd structural traces may reflect practical uses now difficult to reconstruct. A popular rumour claims that these clues add up to hidden technology the public was never meant to see. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it works best in miniature. Not a lost civilization under Broadway, not a secret empire of genius pipes with a union and lunch schedule. Just a handful of strange rooms, clever devices, and forgotten purposes later inflated by the city's natural gift for myth. Historians still argue whether stories like this survive because they preserve a kernel of neglected reality, or because old cities are so good at generating romantic confusion that we cannot help ourselves. That debate will likely continue, and perhaps it should. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Most historians agree that skepticism is necessary. The documented record for a sweeping underground air power network in 1835 is far too thin to support certainty. At the same time, complete dismissal can feel too neat for a city this messy. New York has always rewarded practical improvisation. It has always hidden labour below the surface. It has always rebuilt over yesterday's machinery with very little concern for whether future people might enjoy a proper explanation. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the legend survives because it captures a real sensation from urban modernity's earliest years? The feeling that beneath the visible city, unseen systems were already doing more work than ordinary people understood. That feeling is documented even when the specific machine is not. You live above mechanisms you do not see. You trust rooms you never enter. You hear sounds whose sources remain hidden. In that sense, the tale is not separate from modern life at all. It is one of its earliest whispers. So the old rumour settles into its most believable shape. Somewhere in 1835 Manhattan, perhaps in a merchant cellar, a workshop basement, or a reinforced chamber below a commercial block, there may have been devices using pressure in ways that looked unusual, sounded memorable, and left too little evidence behind. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is plausible enough to wonder about, but not strong enough to declare, and that narrow space between wonder and declaration is where honest bedtime history belongs. Now the city begins to soften around you. The street above grows quieter. The clatter of carts has faded into memory. The wet brick smell cools into something earthier, calmer. The lantern flame in your mind steadies. Those low vaults under Manhattan no longer feel like the stage for a revelation, but for a gentler truth. Cities keep secrets, mostly by forgetting them. Rooms are sealed, machines are removed, records go missing, sounds fade. Then all that remains is a faint pattern like breath on cold air there for a moment, and then gone. And so, as the last of tonight's clues settle into place, you let the question remain a question. You do not force it into a verdict. You do not make the dark do more than the dark can do. You simply stand for one final moment above the layered ground of old New York and imagine the city beneath the city resting, at last its chambers cool, its bricks damp, its iron silent, its mysteries folded gently into sleep. The deeper you breathe, the less the story asks from you. You do not need to solve the cellar. You do not need to label every pipe, every arch, every sealed doorway hidden behind later walls. You only need to let the old city become still. Above the harbour, wind moves softly through the avenues that came later. Below, the forgotten spaces hold their silence with patient dignity. If there were pressure rooms, they are quiet now. If there were only ordinary vaults and practical machines, they too have earned their rest. Some parts were documented, some were interpretation, and some were gentle imagination. That is enough. The stones cool. The lamps dim. The last footstep fades across the street overhead, and then even that disappears. The city for once stops insisting on itself. It becomes weight, depth, and hush. A chamber beneath a chamber. A breath beneath a breath. A final distant sense that history does not always vanish. Sometimes it settles. Sometimes it waits without asking to be found. Sometimes it simply lies under everything newer like a thought you almost remember warm for a second, then softening into darkness. So you let the old pavement close above the story. You let the pipes, if there were pipes, rest inside the brick. You let the arguments of historians drift away with kindness. You let the rumours loosen their grip and float like dust in lantern light. And you leave the underground city as it has so often been left, not conquered, not exposed, but gently imagined, then return to shadow.